This is David Thompson again with DocuTech, bringing you Episode 9 to our TRIDcast series. At DocuTech, we commit to being industry innovators in technology, compliance, and overall customer satisfaction. And with that drive, we wanted to know what would be helpful information for our clients with the new TILA-RESPA integrated disclosures. These TRIDcast episodes are a direct response from the feedback we received. In this episode, we will be taking a closer look at all of the timing requirements associated with TRID. Today, we are privileged to have with us Fred Gooch, DocuTech's General Counsel and Vice President of Compliance, and Timothy Rady, one of DocuTech's Regulatory Compliance Specialists. Timothy is responsible for maintaining and auditing the documentation technology provider's state disclosure matrix and state-specific mortgage loan disclosures. Timothy's efforts play a key role in helping DocuTech's customers prepare for the upcoming TRID reform. A big thanks to both of you for being here today, and without taking up all the time, I'm going to hand it over to Fred.
Thanks, David. As you mentioned, throughout all of these presentations, we have made reference to several different timing rules that apply under the new integrated disclosures rule. And so we thought that today it would be helpful to kind of synthesize all of those timing rules and put them together into one presentation. That way you could review them all and check that against the policies and procedures that you're implementing in your organization to make sure that you can comply with all of the timing rules and requirements. And so pay attention today, and at the very end we are going to have a special quiz or so that you can test your knowledge of the new timing rules that we review during this episode. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is some of the key terms to remember, and we've mentioned these several times during these TRIDcasts, but we thought that it would be a good idea to touch on these briefly before we get into some of the timing requirements. So the first definition that changes is the definition of an application, and an application is when the creditor has received 6 key pieces of information from the consumer. This information is the consumer's name, their income, the social security number, the property address, and an estimate of the value of the property. Also, the last piece of information is the amount of mortgage loan that is sought by the consumer. The key thing to remember in the new rule from the current rule is that the 7th catch-all element has been removed, which means that creditors can no longer choose what other pieces of information they need to have a valid application under the rule. This is completely decided by the statute now, and there is no discretion. So, Timothy, what are some of the other key terms that we need to remember when we're looking at these timing requirements?
So, a very important definition to remember when we're talking about these timing requirements is the definition of business day. Under Regulation Z, particularly under TRID, there are 2 types of business days. There's a general business days, which are the days on which the creditor's office are open to the public. And there are also specific business days, which are calendar days except Sundays, and the listed holidays on the screen. One important thing to remember is that some of these holidays fall on a specific day, such as Christmas. It falls on December 25th. And if that day happens to be on a Saturday, and federal offices are closed the day before in observance, the day that they're closed is not considered a holiday. It's still considered a business day under the definition.
Another key definition that comes into play in these timing rules is that of consummation. Now, a consummation is the time that the consumer becomes contractually obligated on the credit transaction. This is between the consumer and the creditor. It's not when a purchaser might be contractually obligated on a purchase and sale contract. So remember, consummation is when the consumer becomes contractually obligated on the credit transaction. The definition of consummation will vary based on state law, and so that's something that you need to be cognizant of in the states where you're doing business, is when the loan will actually be consummated under state law. Another thing that you need to be mindful of when determining time frames, about giving disclosures, is also whether you'll be able to reset the tolerances when you redisclose the loan estimate or a closing disclosure. There are limited circumstances under the rule that allow you to reset your tolerances. These are often defined as changed circumstances. Timothy, what are some of the changed circumstances that are outlined in the rule?
So some of the changed circumstances under which you can reset your tolerances are an extraordinary event beyond the control of any interested party, or other unexpected events specific to the consumer or transaction, information specific to the transaction or consumer, which were relied upon when you originally provided the loan estimate and which are later found to be inaccurate or which change, or new information specific to the consumer or transaction which were not relied on when the original loan estimate was provided. Some other conditions are if the consumer is ineligible for a previously disclosed estimated charge due to a changed circumstance, which affected the consumer's creditworthiness or the value of the security for the loan. The consumer requests revisions to the credit terms or the settlement that cause an estimated charge to increase. The points or lender credits change because the interest rate was not locked when the original loan estimate was provided, but which is later locked. The consumer indicates an intent to proceed with the transaction more than 10 general business days after the original loan estimate is provided, and transactions involving new construction where the creditor reasonably expects that settlement will occur more than 60 days after the original loan estimate is provided.
Okay, so those are the changed circumstances that are outlined in the rule that allow you to reset your tolerances. But you have to have more than just a changed circumstance to reset your tolerances. As I recall, under the rule, you still have to be out of tolerance, right, Timothy?
Yeah, that's correct. Your fees have to actually go out of tolerance due to a changed circumstance in order for you to redisclose. To be out of tolerance, either the fees that are subject to what we like to call zero tolerances increase, or the aggregate of the fees, which are usually referred to as being a part of the 10% tolerance bucket, exceed the actual 10%.
Okay, so now that we've reviewed changed circumstances and when you can reset your tolerance, let's go ahead and take a look at the timing requirements around delivery of the loan estimate. Now, Timothy, what are the timing requirements around delivery of the loan estimate?
So when you originally provide the loan estimate, and when we talk about provide here, we're not going to be referring to actually providing the loan estimate in person, but we'll do it under the understanding that it's being mailed or e-delivered to the consumer. But when you provide the original loan estimate, it is required to be delivered or placed in the mail no later than 3 general business days after the creditor receives the consumer's application. Now remember, general business days means that the days that the creditor is generally open to the public for business. And it must be provided no later than the 7th specific business day before consummation, unless the borrower waives the timing requirement due to a bona fide personal emergency.
Now, it's my understanding that in order to have a bona fide personal emergency, you have to pretty much have a handwritten statement from the borrower indicating that what their personal financial emergency was, and that creditors are prohibited from providing a pre-printed form for this. So this is something that's very rarely going to happen, right?
That's correct.
Okay. The other rule around the loan estimate is when you would provide a revised loan estimate. And in order to provide a revised loan estimate and to be able to reset your tolerances, the general rule is that it has to be within 3 general business days of receiving information sufficient to establish one of the reasons for revision apply, such as what the changed circumstances that Timothy discussed earlier. However, there are also cases where an interest rate moved from a floating rate to a lock rate. And in that circumstance, you are able to redisclose the loan estimate, and it has to be provided within 3 general business days after the rate is locked. So there's one other rule about when you have to provide the loan estimate, and it has to do with 4 specific business days, right, Timothy?
That's correct.
Why don't you tell us about that?
Okay. So when you provide a revised loan estimate, CFPB didn't want this to be provided after the closing disclosure is provided. So they set up a rule that required that a revised loan estimate has to be received by the consumer, not delivered but received, no later than 4 specific business days prior to consummation. This is in large part due to the timing requirements for the CD, which we'll discuss later on. Now, if the revised LE is not delivered in person, it is considered to have been received by the consumer 3 specific business days after the creditor delivers or places it in the mail. Another requirement in regards to a revised loan estimate is that it needs to be provided before the date on which the creditor provides the original closing disclosure. It can't be provided on or after the same day as the closing disclosure.
So this contemplates a situation where on you would deliver the last revised loan estimate that you could deliver would have to be the day before the closing disclosure is delivered to the borrower, right?
Correct.
And then so you've got your 3 business day rule, which we're going to touch on in a minute for the closing disclosure, which would back you up to 4 business days before consummation would be the last date you could possibly give a revised loan estimate.
It'd be the last date that the consumer receives it. Yes.
Right. Okay. So on to the closing disclosure. As I just mentioned, the closing disclosure is required to be received by the consumer no later than 3 specific business days before consummation. And there's also this caveat in here for a bona fide personal emergency, which is not going to happen very often. I don't believe that it's going to be allowed by most investors, so I think it will be very rare. But if the original closing disclosure is not delivered in person, then it is considered to have been received by the consumer 3 specific business days after it is delivered or placed into the mail. So we are going to apply the mailbox rule here as well. There's also a timing requirement for a revised closing disclosure. What's that, Timothy?
So revised closing disclosure is provided when the information provided in the original closing disclosure becomes inaccurate. It can also be used to reset the tolerances like a revised loan estimate if your timing is so close to closing that you really can't provide a revised loan estimate in time. If you do provide a revised closing disclosure, it has to be provided at or before consummation when the CD becomes inaccurate. However, the creditor must permit the consumer to inspect the revised CD during the general business day immediately preceding consummation.
And that's only if the consumer specifically requests to inspect it?
That's correct. The lender's not required to pad it with an extra day, but if the consumer does request to inspect it, they have to allow the consumer that extra business day.
Okay, so there are 2 circumstances when you are going to provide a revised closing disclosure. There are circumstances where you would be able to provide it and not have to have an additional 3 specific business day waiting period. But there are also circumstances where if you provide a revised closing disclosure and there are certain changes that are taking place, you have to wait an additional 3 specific business days. Those 3 circumstances are, number 1, the APR becomes inaccurate under regulations APR tolerance rules. So those rules are that the APR has to be accurate within 1/8 of 1% for a regular transaction and 1/4 of 1% for an irregular transaction. The next circumstance is when the loan product is changed. And remember that what this means is on page 1 of the loan estimate and the closing disclosure, there's a disclosure of loan product. It's there in the upper right-hand corner. And if you under the regulation, if the loan has changed such that you have to change that description, then you have to wait the additional 3 business days. The third circumstance is when a prepayment penalty is added. The other times when you would redisclose a closing disclosure would be in circumstances when you might do that after consummation of the loan. So what are those, Timothy?
So some of the cases where you would actually provide a revised closing disclosure after consummation are when an event in connection with a settlement occurs that causes one of the charges on the original CD to become inaccurate and the borrower actually pays the amount that's inaccurate, then you need to provide a revised CD within 30 days. Now this is 30 days, calendar days, not business days, after consummation. In other circumstances, when there are non-numerical clerical errors in the original CD, then you need to provide a corrected CD no later than 60 days after consummation. And then amounts paid by the consumer which exceed tolerance limitations, and the creditor refunds the excess no later than 60 days after consummation. Under that circumstance, you would provide a revised CD reflecting this refund, this tolerance refund, and it needs to be provided no later than 60 days after consummation.
And I think one other thing that's important to remember when you're talking about redisclosing the closing disclosure after consummation is if it's a change that affects the amount that the consumer is paying, then the creditor is responsible to make that disclosure to the borrower within this time frame. However, if it's a change that affects the seller's portion of the transaction, it is the settlement agent that's responsible for redisclosing that information to the seller. So this brings us to the part of the presentation that everyone has been anticipating, the test. So take a look at this situation and write down what you think your answers are going to be, and then we're going to go over them after we've given you some time to think about it. Or you can just pause the presentation for a minute. So consider this situation where the application is received on November 24th, 2021, and the consummation occurs at closing, which is going to take place on December 31st, 2021. The creditor is not open to the public on Saturdays. So, the questions are, when must the original loan estimate be mailed? When must the latest revised loan estimate be mailed and received by the consumer if the closing occurs on schedule? And what is the date the CD must be mailed and delivered by the consumer if closing occurs on schedule? So go ahead and pause your video now and see if you can answer the questions. Okay, now we're back. So Timothy, what would be the answers to the questions that we just presented?
Well, one of the reasons we picked 2021 was to throw in some of the hardest examples with the holidays towards the end of the year. So the date the consumer submits his application is going to be November 24th, and you have to you have to deliver the loan estimate within 3 general business days after November 24th. Now, according to this calendar, we have Thanksgiving, which is the date that the creditor is most likely going to be closed for business, so that's not considered business day. First general business day will be the 26th. They're closed for business that weekend, so we don't count those. 29th will be the second general business day, and the 30th will be the third general business day, and the LE must be mailed by that date. Okay, now heading over into December, change of circumstance can happen at any time, but using the example we're giving here, we have a change of circumstance on December 13th, and you have to give the revised LE within 3 general business days after that. So we go December 14th, 15th, 16th, all general business days, and the revised LE must be mailed by the 16th. Now, the last day for revised LE to be received by the consumer under any changed circumstance, if closing is to occur as scheduled, will have to be December 21st, because that will be 4 business days before closing. So in order for the consumer to have received the CD 3 specific business days prior to closing, it's going to have to be delivered by mail at least 3 specific business days before the date that they're received. So you're looking at roughly about 6 specific business days before closing to deliver the CD. So in our test, you would deliver the CD by mail on December 22nd. Your first specific business day is going to be December 23rd. Now, December 24th is going to be the day that most federal offices are going to be closed in observation of Christmas Day, because that falls on a Saturday. However, under TRID, that is not to be considered a holiday. It's still to be considered a specific business day. So we count the 24th as the second specific business day. We go over the weekend. December 27th is going to be your third specific business day, and that is the day that the receipt of the CD by the consumer will need to occur at the very latest. And then you have to wait for your 3 specific business day waiting period, which will be December 28th, 29th, and 30th. And then you can close on December 31st.
Wow. Well, thanks, Timothy. All of those rules all put together on a calendar like this, in a time when you've got holidays and whatnot, becomes quite an interesting puzzle to all put together. So there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that that lenders and creditors have policies and procedures and checks in place to make sure that they get this all right. If I had to rename this TRIDcast, I would rename it Timing Requirements Under the TRID Rule, or How I Learned How to Count to 3, 4, and 7. It seems to be a lot more complicated than it first seems. I think that's all that we have for this episode. David?
Well, thanks, guys, for being here today. We definitely appreciate the insight. For all of our viewers, DocuTech would love to answer any of your integrated disclosure questions, so please submit your questions to trid@docutechcorp.com. Our next episode will be on June 16th at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, where we will be doing a deep dive into the loan estimate. To learn about DocuTech, see a previous episode, or get a copy of today's show sheet, visit our website at www.docutechcorp.com. You can also reach a member of our team at 800-497-3584. And again, thanks for watching.